In this lecture, we will discuss about joints, muscle, tendons, and the nervous system. Let me remind you about the joints. The joint is the site where two parts of the body are fitted together. The function of the joint is to support of the body and for the movement. We can classify joints according to their structure. There are three types of joints from structural classification. They are fibrous joint, cartilaginous joint, and synovial joint. Fibrous joint, their bones are joined together with the fibrous tissue. Cartilaginous joint, the bones are united by cartilage tissue. Synovial joint is a special type of joint, and we need to discuss a little bit more detail. Synovial joints, the adjoining bones are separated by joint cavity. The bone ends in the joint are covered with articular cartilage, which is made of hyaline cartilage, and the joint is enclosed with the articular capsule. And that articular capsule is lined by outer fibrous and inner synovial membranes. If we classify joints according to their mobility, we can say synarthrosis. Syn means together, arthrosis means joint. That means immobile joint. Or amphiarthrosis, which might be partly mobile, or diarthrosis, which is a freely mobile joint. So if you look at this table carefully, only the synovial joints are diarthrodial joints. So that means only the synovial joints have free mobility. But at the same time, not all synovial joints are freely mobile. This is the characteristics of a typical synovial joint, which we have discussed. And the movement in the synovial joints can be rotation, angulation, or gliding movement. Now let's go back to the previous lecture briefly, like the sensory receptors in the skin and the reflex. Here we have let's say, for example, this is a spike stimulus, which encounters with the tip of the finger. And that stimulus will be received by the receptors in the skin. And that sensory information will be taken via the sensory neuron. And that will enter into the spinal cord, which is an integrating center. And that sensory neuron will relay that information on interneuron, and that interneuron will come and synapse with the motor neuron, which is also called efferent neuron, which come out from the anterior root or ventral root of the spinal cord, and come and act on the effector organ, which is the muscle. And because of this stimulus, this muscle gets contracted at reflex level, and we will withdraw from the painful stimulus. And reflex, as we know, it is a stimulus response mechanism which is happening at subconscious level. And now, in this lecture, we will focus more on the muscle stretch reflexes. And some textbook might also mention this as deep tendon reflexes. These are the integral part of the neurological examination. And when you do the clinical rotations, I believe you will see these reflexes being done, especially in the neurology ward. Stretch reflex is an involuntary reaction And that reaction caused by the muscle, which is being passively stretched. And in this diagram, by percussion of the tendon. So now, here we have our quadricep muscle, which is the big muscle in front of our thigh. And that quadricep muscle became quadricep tendon, which will come and attach to the patella. From patella, patellar ligament comes, and then it will go attached to the tibial tuberosity, which is located in the upper part of the tibia. So now we strike the patellar ligament with the reflex hammer. There is a sudden strike, which makes the patellar ligament to get extended rapidly. The quick stretch of the muscle tendon unit that stimulate the muscle spindles, here muscle spindles, receptor, and then this in turn increase the firing rate in the muscle spindle. And this increase in firing rate will be carried by the sensory nerve to the spinal cord, and there will be integration and act on the synapse with the motor neuron and come and give the contraction of the effector organ, which we will see as extension of the knee. So now if we look a bit more carefully inside our muscle means the one we were talking about, flexion and extension. These muscles, inside these muscles, we have the muscle spindles, which are being stimulated, and that stimulation causing increased firing rate, increased generation of the action potential. Then that will be carried by the sensory neuron, go to the spinal cord, act on the motor neuron directly, and motor neuron will give the act on the muscle, which will give the contraction of the muscle. But at the same time, the same motor neuron, if you see here, which is colored with green, act on the interneuron, which will act on another motor neuron, which will come out as an efferent motor neuron, and that way have inhibitory effect on the antagonist muscle here. So for example, in our thigh, these are the quadriceps, which are front of the thigh. They are in contraction, and this motor neuron will have inhibitory effect on the hamstring muscle, which are the muscles in the posterior aspect of the thigh. They will be inhibited, and therefore we have the sudden extension of the knee joint. So the receptors in our tendons, joints, and muscles, they are called proprioceptors. We have three types of proprioceptors. They are muscle spindle, tendon organs, and joint kinesthetic receptors. So muscle spindles are present in the muscle. Tendon organs are present in the tendon, especially at the junction of tendon and muscle, musculotendinous junction. And kinesthetic receptors are present in the joint capsule of the synovial joints. Now, if we look more closely, this is the muscle bulk, which we see with our eyes, and this muscle bulk, which is giving us contraction and relaxation, shortening and lengthening of the muscle. That muscle fibers are called extrafusal muscle fibers. So in between the extrafusal muscle fibers, here we can see, which is color with purple, light purple color, little capsules. These capsules are called muscle spindles. So muscle spindles are lying in between the muscle fibers. And in the muscle spindles, we have intrafusal muscle fibers that we can see. These intrafusal muscle fibers are encycled wrapped around with the nerve endings, and that nerve endings are sensory nerve endings, which we traverse along as sensory motor neuron. And these muscle spindles, they act on the length of the muscle, so that they measure the amount of stretch. And now we can the tendon organ. They are situated more at the myotendinous junction, and they are also called Golgi tendon. These Golgi tendons, we measure the force of the, they measure the force. So now if we look at that extrafusal muscle fiber, in between extrafusal, we have intrafusal muscle fibers. Intravusal muscle fibers are encircled with the sensory nerve fibers, and that sensory nerve fibers will leave as sensory motor neuron. And in a resting state, there is a just simple constant generation of the action potential here. But once the muscle is being stretched here, the stretching activates the muscle spindles, which will increase the firing rate of action potential in the sensory neuron, and that action potential will travel along the sensory neuron. So now we know what a reflex arc is. What is a reflex? What are the requirements of the reflex arc? They are sensory receptor, sensory neuron, integrating center, efferent neuron, and effector organ. And we know the receptors for the joints, muscles, and tendons. They are muscle spindle, Golgi tendon or tendon organ, and joint kinesthetic receptors. Muscle spindles, we measure the length of the muscle. The tendon organs, we measure the force magnitude of the tension, and joints kinesthetic receptor, we measure the stretch in the synovial joint, and we also sense the nociceptors. So now here we come. So the patellar ligament is being struck with the reflex hammer, and that causes the sudden stretch in the patellar ligament, and that will stretch the quadricep muscle. And that quadricep muscle stretching will be sensed by the intrafusal muscle fibers in the muscle spindles, and there will be increasing firing rate, which will be carried by the sensory motor neuron, and that sensory motor neuron will synapse directly with the motor neuron, which is colored with red. That motor neuron will come and act on the effector organ, which is the quadricep muscle, which will cause the flexion of the quadricep muscle. But at the same time, this sensory motor neuron will act on the interneuron, and that interneuron will act on the another motor neuron, which is colored with purple, and that motor neuron will have inhibitory effect on the hamstring muscle, which is the antagonist to the quadricep. And because of the antagonist effect on the hamstring, there is less restriction, and there will be sudden extension of the knee. Of course, we were talking about just the somatic sensory neurons and somatic sensory receptors, which are just colored with blue here. At some point in the later part of the semester, we have to talk about visceral sensory neuron, which are coming from the visceral organs such as stomach, intestine. And we need to know what's happened if we stretch on the intestine. As a reminder, I believe you remember we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 sacral vertebrae, which are fused, and 4 coccygeal vertebrae, which are fused. And the spinal cord runs in the spinal canal, which are on the posterior aspect of the vertebra. And from the spinal cord, spinal nerves come out. So for the first cervical nerve from the spinal cord, we come out from the spinal cord above the cervical 1 vertebral body. And second cervical nerve, spinal nerve, we come out from the spinal cord above the second vertebral body, and so on. And if we look, seven cervical spinal nerve, we come out above the 7 cervical vertebra. But in the cervical level, there are 8 cervical nerves, and therefore 8 spinal nerves come out from the spinal cord below the body of the 7 cervical vertebra. And in thoracic region, we have 12 thoracic vertebra, and we only have 12 thoracic spinal nerve. In the lumbar region, the same. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and we only have 5 lumbar spinal nerves. And these spinal nerves, we carry motor and sensory. And we talk about dermatomes. Dermatomes, these are the area of the skin which is supplied by the cutaneous supply of that particular segment of the single spinal nerve. And now we need to talk about myotomes. Myotome is the portion of the skeletal muscle which is innervated by the particular single spinal nerve. So dermatome is for sensation by the particular level spinal nerve. Myotome is the skeletal muscle supply which is coming from the single spinal nerve. And this is what we need to do in the lab. We will have to do deep tendon reflexes, and we will relate to their myotomes. For example, like what we did in this lecture, we did the patellar tendon reflex. The nerve root, spinal nerve root is like lumbar 2, 3, 4, but mainly lumbar 4. And let's see what's happened when we do this lab exercise. I will see you tomorrow in the lab.